So welcome to the fourth lecture for the third week, and what I'll be talking about today is how we can extend some of the issues we talked about in in the philosophy of just institutions to public housing, and specifically public housing in the urban setting, because a certain number of issues come up that's specific to cities. So earlier this week, or rather last week, because we sort of carried things over into this week, we talked about Rawls's argument for redistribution, and in fact a lot of it, so rather dramatic redistribution of wealth, and Nozick's argument against it. And so Rawls was claiming that, these sort of typical features that we have that make it that often determine whether we do well in society and do well making money or obtaining certain status, don't really belong to us in the sort of robust way we usually think they do. So intelligence, or our ability to work hard, or inheritance and such, these sort of traits or features of us are not something that we can claim entirely to ourselves. And by having them, we are required to obtain things for other people as well. So we're only allowed to have certain positions or a certain amount of wealth if it helps others, even when our intelligence or other features of ourselves are what brought us to have this sort of wealth. And Nozick had a libertarian argument against this, saying, well, this ignores how people trade with each other and how people actually become wealthy, and usually it's through just trades. And so Rawls's sort of view of the ideal distribution of wealth ignores what justice of trades are. So in the next two lectures, I'm going to assume that Rawls is right, and I add at least sort of. So we're going to weaken Rawls's claim a little bit at the end of this lecture to make things more interesting, because what Rawls is advocating for is very dramatic redistribution, and essentially whenever we question whether we should give lower income people certain things, especially related to housing, Rawls is probably going to say yes. And so so that's less interesting. And also, if we assume Nozick was right, it'd also be less interesting, because Nozick would say no, we should never provide housing for people who haven't earned it in the market, so to speak, so who haven't traded for it and such. And so, unless they've been wrong. So we'll leave sort of Nozick aside, and then we'll weaken Rawls at some point. It continues. The issue continues that even if we accept Rawls's view, we still need to see what this means for public policy. So in this lecture, I'll talk about how such a view, redistribution, thinking that redistribution is permissible and something we're obligated to do, what that means for public housing, for providing housing to people who can't normally afford it. And then in the next lecture, I'll talk about how this informs of obligations you might have to provide public transportation systems of a certain quality. So let's first spell out some assumptions. First of all, we'll have to say that housing is a social good. So what Rawls was talking about is that there's these general goods that are good for us regardless of our conception of the good. So regardless of what we think is good for us, as long as that's a rational conception, which he requires, that we didn't really talk much about, but he requires certain rationality to one's conception of the good. So as long as, regardless of that, it's a good for them. And it seems like housing is plausibly such a thing. But we have to specify what exactly we mean by housing and what is important about housing, because it's not the housing itself which is important. It's not the housing itself that is the good, right? It's the fact that the person can live in the housing. So it's the fact that it's shelter. We might also think that the fact that, it's not just an empty box, right? It has plumbing, it has a refrigerator, certain conveniences like that. It's free of vermin. It has heat, and possibly in certain climates cooling. And I think that these are these sort of minimum requirements, these luxuries and conveniences, which would not be minimum requirements 300 years ago, right? They didn't exist, but they do today. That these things must exist for it to be considered the sort of social good we're talking about. You might also think that housing should have certain, artistic qualities or aesthetic qualities. You might worry that if people are forced to live in terrible, boxy postmodern architecture that makes you want to kill yourself, that this is wrong, right? So sort of putting people in environments that we know might cause unhappiness or something, or environments that might increase the potential for crime, and we'll talk about that later in this class, the last section, what sort of features of buildings make for good housing. So we might think that certain qualities like that are also important. And lastly, and this is what will be the focus of the last part of this lecture, is we might think that a location is important. So a desirable location. What do we mean by this? Well, a location that is integrated with the rest of the city. So has things that people need, has grocery stores, has easily accessible transit, and also you might think is in sort of a pleasant area, is in a pleasant neighborhood, and where maybe a certain vibrancy exists. So you might think that, or you might not. So one question we will have to ask is whether placing public housing in the middle of an empty field on the outside of the city that has no real value as a space, right? It's the land might almost be without value. There's almost no demand for it. That these sort of locations are not good enough, and that we really do need to integrate low-income people with the rest of the city. We can't place them somewhere where they have no access to the rest of society with everyone else. So that's going to be a concern, because that's going to have drawbacks. If we really think we want to integrate them with the rest of the city and put them in places, put their housing in places that have real value, that you can't just have infinite amount of. There's only so much space in a city, right? So if you put free housing there, it's going to take away from what other people can have. And so we'll have to discuss whether that's a certain minimum we can allow for housing. So another assumption we'll have to make, and I think this is probably right, is that we live in a very rich society. So this might not be true for other societies. So this is specific for Western civilization. So in U.S. specifically. So we don't have to worry about Rawls's savings principle, as you heard about in the last lecture, or 2 lectures ago. What Rawls says is that you can only redistribute as much as you can while still saving enough for the future. But then he also says, in societies that are extremely rich, this is not much of a concern, because you have plenty for the future, for future generations. And so what I'm going to assume is that, yeah, there really isn't much to be concerned about. And so if we follow Rawls closely, we can distribute quite a lot. And as you remember, he thinks we just should redistribute as much as gets the worst off, the best, right? So you want the worst off to be the best they can possibly be. And that's going to be a pretty substantial amount of redistribution under Rawls, likely. So, and also we can assume that a better provision of housing. So, better housing is better for the worst off than worse housing or no housing at all. And I think that's a pretty easy assumption to make. So let's first talk about what exactly exists as far as housing provisions in the U.S., at least for 21st century U.S. And we'll talk about the history of this a little bit. So first of all, most of the federal housing subsidies, so and this means most of the housing subsidies in general come from what's called Section 8 housing subsidies. And what this comes from, this is just, sort of now a shorthand for housing subsidies. This comes from the Section 8 of the Housing Act of 1937, and it specified a way by which housing vouchers could be paid to landlords such that low-income people could obtain housing that they might not otherwise be able to afford. And so this is means tested, so you have to be at a certain low level of income, and this varies based upon family size. In other cases, if you're disabled, I think the minimum is higher as well. But these are poor people. These are generally, you have to be rather poor to meet this. And what happens is you find housing, so you obtain the voucher. The voucher is sort of connected to you, and then you go looking for an apartment, and landlords generally can't discriminate against you for this, but they can use other methods. So they can discriminate based upon income and such. And so there's ways of getting around this. So generally, landlords can keep people with Section 8 vouchers from using their apartments, but there's some laws that do restrict this. But generally, landlords are able to do this. So what you do, though, is you go out and find a apartment which will accept a Section 8 voucher, and then the voucher goes directly to the landlord, and then you're responsible for whatever's left over. So the amount of your voucher will depend upon your income. So this is done in, it's supposed to be a market-based solution, right? So this sort of method is supposed to get the government out of it a little bit. We'll see in a little bit on the same slide that the government also does other things which are not related to these vouchers. But entire buildings can just be Section 8 housing vouchers. So some landlords find this to be a very, it's very stable income, because you're pretty much guaranteed tenants if you open up your apartments to these. But otherwise, some units can be, and perhaps a single unit in a housing complex could be a Section 8 housing voucher person. So the important feature is that the voucher goes with the person. They can decide where to live within certain constraints, and this is supposed to give them a certain amount of choice, and to keep everything private, right? It's keep the government out of housing. However, there are sometimes entire government-owned buildings that exist outside of these voucher systems. So so I don't want to get into the nitty-gritties of the law, because it's not very important, but at certain points, especially in the middle 20th century, the government just built buildings for the poor, and these were often federally funded, but there was a lot of municipal, so local agencies often ran these things. So it was sort of a joint venture between local and federal governments, and so these are what you might call the projects, right? So these are housing projects where the idea was to just supply a ton of housing for people who needed it, who couldn't afford housing outside of this area. So they couldn't afford housing in the market itself, right, in the housing market. And so the idea was the government would just provide it to them. And so, that's a nice idea, right? So, and I believe in Europe this still occurs more often. In the U.S., though, it's, the federal government has tried to disinvest itself from such projects, and many of these public housing, like I know in Chicago especially, they had a huge number of projects, and they've just been destroying them, essentially. They've been dismantling them in the past 20 years and moving these tenants to other areas. So not to just totally owned by the government projects, but to individual apartments and such. So, and finally, a more locally driven, there's some federal money in this as well, but more locally driven alternative is to have affordable, I'm just put this in quotes, so they're called affordable housing units. So these are often below market value, and they're sometimes they're for low-income people, like very low-income people, but they're also for medium-income people. And I know Montgomery County has a program for this, where you can meet income requirements above those required for the voucher. So you wouldn't qualify for Section 8, but you might qualify for these sort of units. And usually these arise because the local government wants to have a certain mixture of income in a certain area, and there's new developments, and they negotiate with the developers to set aside these units to be affordable. So these are below market units, so the rents are not at market. And there's sometimes they're paid by, these developers are paid by the government directly for the rest of it, or there's some sort of agreement made that you can actually build here if you have these and take a hit in that way. I mean, that's not important how that works, but the important thing is that they're below market, and the government is sort of forcing this to occur. And they can also be partially paid by vouchers. But so I mean, these are sort of the important three types of things that go on in housing, American housing. As I just said, there has been an important movement away from housing projects, which were developed in the 40s and 50s especially, towards housing vouchers. And a number of things have led to this. So so this will be slightly historical. So what you need to know is that especially in the 40s and 50s, so and to some degree in the 30s, sort of New Deal programs, these housing programs were developed. And part of the idea, so this was different from Section 8 housing funding, the idea was to get rid of slums. So there were these terrible areas that it was seen by the government. There were areas full of crime. People had terrible living conditions, often without running water, no convenient, no modern conveniences whatsoever. And so the idea was to get rid of the slums and replace them with high-rises or sometimes low-rise buildings. So these would be designed to see large areas of high-rise buildings, and these were sort of the beginnings of the projects. But one problem, so there's a few problems with this. I mean, one is that it created highly concentrated poverty. And in some ways it just maintained it, right? I mean, these were poor areas to begin with. And oftentimes it's because the property values were so low that the government needed to pay them very little, if anything, to take over this land, and these people often had very little, inroads into government, and so weren't able to defend their property and their homes. And in middle class and upper class neighborhoods, this wasn't really a problem. Property was expensive, and people living there also were able to thwart anything like this. So there's highly concentrated poverty is one problem. But if you remember from the Jane Jacobs reading that we talked about, so Jacobs was describing what a lot of people call a slum in Boston. And she was saying, man, this has really nice urban features, and it allows for a really well-regulated neighborhood, even when there is extensive poverty. So one problem is that in high poverty areas, you'll often have a lot of crime, and what Jacobs thought is that certain design features make it such that you don't have this crime, and that's great. And so so what she certainly thought, so she was writing in the late 60s, and she was seeing a lot of this slum removal. This is what she was talking about. And she thought, man, this is really reducing the quality of our living environments. And so you're putting people in areas that are going to be worse for them. And we can see this sort of process in Southwest DC. So here's, you have to forgive the little overlays of the text. This comes from a website that actually has historical aerial photographs. And this is not for commercial use, so I can do this. So this is the area just south of the mall in Washington, D.C., so the National Mall. And, this is the Potomac River. And the tidal basin should be over here somewhere. The mall is up here in this. So roughly like L'Enfant Plaza Metro would be around here, I think. Yeah, somewhere around here. And there's the waterfront is down here currently. If you've been there, with the fish and such, so you can buy fresh fish and such. So it's a tiny part of DC, and this is what it used to be like. So this is an aerial photograph from 1949, and you can see that the structure is very similar to other neighborhoods in DC, like Shaw or Capitol Hill, right? So you have the grid system. It's a very standard grid system, and you have a bunch of row houses. And so that's how it was, and it was a very poor area. So that the houses were in disrepair oftentimes. They lack certain amenities that are pretty standard, and it was generally seen by most people to be a terrible slum that needed to get rid of. And that's exactly what they did. So in 1963, they obliterated the area, essentially. So this is 395, I think. I'm getting that wrong. But this is basically the highway just south of the mall. And this was the period of time when they were putting highways through many neighborhoods. And what they thought was, well, we're going to do all this construction. We're going to put this highway through to ease traffic and such. And why don't we just get rid of all these buildings and replace them with nice new high-rise buildings with all the modern trappings of modern living, and this will improve people's lives, lower crime, etc. And really they were thinking of using the sort of standards of like garden cities, right? So you'd have these high rises in this sort of fields, in fields with playgrounds and such. And the thought was that this would be an improvement. So here we see, they built these. So some of these are federal buildings north here, but other things here, a lot of these buildings are partially projects, but also apartment buildings. And it looks kind of nice from right here, but it remained a dead part of the city essentially. Partially because it was cut off by this highway, but also just because they had gotten rid of the structure. You might think they had gotten rid of the structure of the city and replaced it with a sterile environment that was worse than what was there before. So you might have improved the the living conditions slightly, but these areas tend to be more crime-ridden than they might have otherwise been before. So this is what Jacobs was thinking about when she was writing about these Boston neighborhoods that people wanted to replace. This is sort of what they wanted to replace it with, this sort of construction with new high-rise public housing and other apartments. So this is what was concerning Jacobs when she was writing. And a further thing is, when you do this, it has this effect of taking poor people out of the normal market for housing. When you have a housing project, which is owned by the government, as many of these were, and you are simply allowing people to live there directly and not just giving them money to go out, or giving them a voucher to go out into the market and buy their own housing, you are in a way making them wards of the state essentially. They're dependent upon the state for housing. They're separated from other people who are in the market, right? They're in their own buildings, these often entire areas full of these buildings, which were separate from the city. In the case of Southwest DC, it really was, right? It was separated from the rest of the city by a highway, and it was very hard to get back and forth. And so that's problematic. And Jacobs thought, this is terrible. Why are we doing this? we should just be allowing people to choose their housing as others do. They don't have the means to pay for the housing, and so if we want to redistribute, as Rawls thinks we should, why don't we just give them a voucher or give them money to do this? And so that's one reason why they moved away from this idea of just building housing for people and moved towards vouchers that they could spend in the market. Another reason, though, was these sort of housing projects tended to be very segregated. So you would often have entire areas just full of one group of the same race and the same socioeconomic background. And in the during the civil rights movement, we wanted to move away from this this sort of model of keeping people separate if they're of different types, right? If they're of different race or of different classes. And we wanted to move towards a more integrated society. And so if you think this is important, then segregation of people into these different areas and keeping people of lower income out of the market seemed to contradict this. And so it seems like we needed to move towards something else, and vouchers were it. So now we sort of talked about what housing provision is in the U.S. We need to examine more, like, what exactly is decent housing going to be? So we might think that the state has no obligation to provide extravagant housing or even nice housing, right? So it might just have to offer a very rudimentary form of housing that might not include all the niceties that we like. Rawls is going to say it's probably going to have to provide nice housing or something quite good, as we were discussing before. But let's leave that aside, and so we might weaken Rawls's view a little bit to make things interesting, and just follow this intuition that we have that we don't have to provide good housing to people, just decent housing, minimally decent, we might say, and we need to figure out what exactly that means. Again, borrowing from Rawls, even though we weakened his view a little bit, it should be a basic social good, so it should provide the things that we think a basic social good should provide. It should help people achieve their ends. It should not hinder them. So the housing shouldn't cause problems for them, which some housing does, right? If someone is constantly concerned about a leaky roof, or they can't take showers or baths, right? I mean, how can they compete in the market, right? If we expect people to pursue their ends, and many of those ends will include being employed and being able to achieve things, then it seems like if we're just giving them very terrible housing, that might make them sick. It might, won't allow them to go to a job, right? If you can't take showers on a regular basis, it's very hard to keep a job. And because they're forced to compete with others who have these sort of decent provisions, and might even live in nice housing, we might think that certain things are required to allow them to pursue those ends. So this wouldn't be the case 300 years ago when no one had plumbing, or at least hot water, or most people didn't have good plumbing. So that's not a case back then, but now, because they're in a market with people who have these things, they might require these things. So it seems plausible that certain material standards are important for decent housing. And that seems to be what we've agreed on in society as well. You can't just give someone a hut, a shack or something, right, that has nothing. You need to give them certain things that we'd call conveniences. But they're necessities almost in modern life. But what I'm going to talk about in the last part of this lecture is this question of whether location is one of these things that makes housing decent. So is housing in a field away from everyone else decent housing? Can we just give poor people the leftover land, housing on the leftover land, and call that decent housing and say, well, we fulfilled our obligation to provide housing? So Rawls would say probably yes, location does matter. But let's, we've weakened Rawls a little bit, and let's just think about whether we think location might matter. Now, a voucher will be a set amount of money. So if we think that vouchers should normally be how we pay for low-income housing, providing vouchers, this will not pay all the expenses in certain very expensive neighborhoods. So I think now the maximum voucher this would be for like a large household, something like $2,200. And if we are to maintain certain standards for housing, then that amount of voucher will not pay for such a family to live in a high rent area. And so if we think that we should have people living in these areas, if we think that we're obligated to provide this location to people of low income, then we'll have to do something else. So we can do a few things, and this will be our question, whether we should do these things. So, we can ask whether we should mandate below market rent units. So these would be special units, we do this often now, that just are, do not charge the amount that is required for the market, that's at the amount that normal renters pay at market values. We could build public housing buildings ourselves, and there's been some of this, scattered buildings in different neighborhoods. These buildings might be entirely dedicated to low-income people, or only partially. Or we could encourage units only supported by vouchers in very desirable neighborhoods. So we could do these different things, and they're all certain solutions that might have drawbacks, but they all will have certain problems. So first, we need to consider why we might think this is an obligation. Let's motivate this view that location is a part of decency that we were talking about before. First of all, location is very important for economic opportunity. And as we were talking about before, Rawls's view is that, people deserve to have certain goods that allow them to achieve their ends, whatever they may be. And location is almost certainly one of those things. So being in, if you're living in New York City, you might have certain opportunities, or living inside DC, that would not be presented to someone living in, rural Maryland or something. There are more jobs. It's easier for you to go to certain jobs. There's more places to buy things. There's more social opportunities. So it seems like location is important for economic opportunities and social opportunity as well. Also, we might think that if we allow lower income people to live in neighborhoods they might not otherwise be able to afford, this will prevent income and racial segregation. Looking at DC, most of lower income people are not white in the city of DC. And so you have certain neighborhoods, especially in the upper reaches of Northwest DC, like Cleveland Park or other areas like that, which are almost entirely white and entirely rich. So this is, and there's some housing in those areas that are below market, but these areas are not diverse at all in that way. And if you think that's a problem, then you might think that we should provide housing at below market rates in these areas and provide this sort of diversity. And also, this is especially started to arise, within recent years. People have thought that, maybe living close to where you work is, the ability to do that is, maybe something that we are obligated to provide for people. So there's some neighborhoods. So again, take Cleveland Park. Service people who work in the restaurants, people who work in the stores, people who work in the hotels, and the apartments themselves would not be able to afford to actually live in that neighborhood. And some people think this is somewhat perverse, right? So these are people who have a role in this neighborhood. They work there, They provide services for people who live there, and yet they themselves cannot afford to live there. They have to live somewhere else and commute in. And it's unclear what exactly is wrong with this, but you can sort of get a feeling for what might be wrong with it. And we don't need to go too deep into it, but at least the intuition might be there that this seems like something that should be changed. But, there's always losers in these sort of situations, and when you provide below market rent to some people, there are some losers, to that situation. So what does this do? Well, it lowers the supply, right? So if you are providing below market rates to some people, those apartments are not available to anyone else, right? So other people who aren't in the voucher program or aren't in medium income or whatever just can't obtain these, and that in a sense takes those units out of the market, the wider market of everyone who's not in these special programs, and that's problematic. So who's the biggest losers in these cases? Well, it's those who earn too much for a voucher, or who earn too much to qualify for these programs where you can get below market rates, but who just barely could afford the before voucher market rate. So who could if there was no housing assistance, these people might be able to afford an apartment there, but now because there is a housing assistance, and I'll show you why we might think that this is the case, they can't afford it. And so these people are actually excluded from this area, even though if there was no housing provisions or whatever for the very poor, they would be able to buy into this market. And this seems like a concern. So also, those who can afford the new market rate, so after the vouchers, are forced to subsidize lower income people, more so than other people in society are forced to subsidize lower income people. Because the rate has increased, because the market supply is smaller, the rate has increased, they now pay more. And they're, in a sense, subsidizing these people who are of lower income. And that subsidization to them, so the redistribution from them, is going to be rather large because it's not coming from the wider society, where it usually comes from. And also, oftentimes, when you take a set of units out of the market, so they no longer have to compete with the market units, the housing quality will decrease because there's usually a lot of demand for these sort of programs. It's very hard to get one of these units. Because there's so much demand, the quality needn't be high because people will always take them. And so oftentimes you'll see that these units start out really nice. When they're first built, units for the poor who can't usually afford them are very nice, these sub-market units. But they decline rapidly because there's no incentive for the landlord to make them, to keep them up. And so the government certainly has certain standards, but those standards are often lower than the market otherwise would be. So the housing stock lowers in quality. So let's look quick and see why we might think that the supplying subsidies to people will actually increase the price for others. So on the x-axis here I have supply, right? On the y-axis I have the price, and the way this is a supply and demand curve basically, or graph. And the way this works is this is the demand curve. So okay, so this is kind of easy to understand once you sort of figure it out. But so what this curve means is that holding demand stable. So let's imagine the demand does not change, and this is probably what we should assume because there's a lot of demand for the housing in such area. It's from a lot of people, right? And so these are at market because these are not low-income people. The demand would not exist from low-income people because they can't pay the amount that's demanded by the market. So the demand's at a certain level. Let's hold that steady. By subsidizing some housing units, we take those out of the market, essentially, right? So what we do is we go along this curve, right? So so let's imagine this dot is where it starts out, where the price starts out before we take any units out of the market. So we don't subsidize any units. Those units are open to anyone who can pay the money for them, and they're at a certain market price. Note, this price will be higher than what low-income people can afford. We can imagine they might be able to afford a price like here, and they can't afford it. So they are excluded from the market simply because they don't have enough money. But what happens when we take some supply out of the market? So we take some units out of the market, we reduce supply, the dot goes along this curve, and how the demand curve works is as supply decreases, the price increases. And so what that means is that people will have to pay more to get an at-market apartment. And we might imagine there are some people at this level who, and it would not increase by that much, of course. If we think that this is like a lot that it increased, it might be rather small. But there's some people who, could have paid that amount, who might have been down here. They could have paid that amount down here, but now that the supply has decreased, they can no longer afford it, or they don't want to give up other things to be able to afford it. And so those people are being excluded. And the people who can afford it, maybe they can afford a price like this. Before they were only paying this much, and they could spend their money on other things or save it or whatever. And now they have to spend this much. So they are not excluded from the market. They have enough money, but they have to pay more now. And so this is the subsidy, essentially, that they're supplying to the low market people, the amount it moved here. And this is above and beyond the amount that's actually being spent by the government. This is coming directly from these people who are spending more money. So we might. So the question is this all a problem? So should we take the concerns of segregation and location being an important factor of people being able to obtain their ends and so forth as enough reason to do these sorts of things in cities? Or should we be really concerned about the costs to people who are trying to buy at market rates? So a lot of this is going to be affected by how much we actually do. So if only a very few number of units are being converted to low-income housing, then there's not much concern. The price adjustment's going to be tiny, and no one will probably notice it. But as some people want to do, some people make these claims that we should make a substantial amount of our housing in cities below market. So in some way, that that could actually have an effect on the housing market, on the price of the other units, and that's concerning. So that that might make you question whether this is good policy. And notice that this really only affects people living in dense areas or people living in cities where space is important. So in a suburb where you can pretty much add housing anywhere and the land is very cheap, the only price you pay is the price of actually building the homes and maintaining them. And this is the price paid by the government or paid by some other people. So, but it's not coming from people who live there directly, right? And so it's shared, the burden is shared by the society at large or something. So that's less problematic. But the problem becomes, for cities, we only have so much space. Space is at a premium. Most of the value of homes are, in most cases, are not the stuff on the land, but the land itself. It's the location itself. And so, these concerns are special to cities. So we might think that we do have this obligation. So, we might say, well, I understand that this causes certain problems for the market, but still we need to do something. So Rawls might say this. So what you need to do maybe is compensate residents in some way. So make it such that they're not carrying the burden of this increased price by themselves. We generally don't do this. This burden, if there's any, is borne by the the members of society. And it might be very complicated, like how you would do this. It might involve lowering property taxes, but then you'd have this problem of how is the city going to fund its programs and such. So it's really it's not clear how you would actually fix this. I mean, there might be some way of doing it, but this is sort of a nitty-gritty policy question and question of economics that we're not going to really talk about here. But you could go that way, but you could go another way, and this is the way that we'll be talking about next time. You might just say that we're not obligated to provide low-income people with housing in the high-demand areas, or at least we're not required to provide many of them with such a thing. But we need to provide them access to all these areas in the city. So this is generally the way we do things. So if you go to some place like Cleveland Park, it's mostly going to be very high high-income rents. Most of the market is these high-income rents. Only a few of it, a little bit of it is the lower income, below market rents. But we do provide heavily subsidized public transit, which in DC is of pretty high quality. You can say things about Metro or things about the Metro buses, but it's of pretty high quality. So this is one solution. And so you might think, people don't really we don't have an obligation to provide them with the actual space, right? Because this space is being taken from other people, and these problems are too problematic to solve in that way. But we could provide public transit, and this will be what we'll talk about next time. So next time we are going to talk about whether we're obligated to provide quality public transit systems, and if so, what sort of things should we provide? Some people say that public transit should be paid entirely by the users. So most public transit systems are heavily subsidized ventures, and so we were talking about earlier that most of the private public transit or private mass transit systems went out of business in the 50s. With the advent of cars, most people have automobiles, have personal automobiles, and so there really is not a market that will support the sort of public transit, no private market that will support the sort of public transit that we might think is required to give people some bare minimum ability to transport themselves around a city. And so, part of the obligations of a government, of a city government, of a metropolitan government, maybe of a federal government, is to provide such a system and to subsidize it. So that's what we'll talk about next time. I should have that lecture up tomorrow or the next day, and I'll have some more readings up to probably Wednesday for the next week, so for week 4. Okay, so I'll see you later.